I'm Anna Guest, the founder of Rising Tide Volunteer Solutions, and I'm really excited for this conversation today with Sarah Sukram, exploring mental health boundaries and self-care for ourselves as volunteer leaders. Sarah is the volunteer and foster care coordinator with Animal Services in Pasco County, Florida, and holds a certification in volunteer administration. I met Sarah recently at a gathering of volunteer leaders and was so intrigued by her thoughts and wisdom on how we manage our own mental health amidst the difficult situations that inevitably come up when working closely with and leading volunteers. So, welcome, Sarah. Please feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourself, the work that you do, and how volunteers are a part of that.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Anna. I'll start by talking a little bit about our organization. So we are a municipal shelter. We are based in the Tampa Bay area, and we oversee animal control as well as animal sheltering. We do adoptions. We are a Save 90 facility, which means that we aim to save at least 90% of the adoptable animals that come into our care. And so with that, volunteers are really a part of everything we do. We have 4 departments here under our branch, and they are in everything from greeting citizens as they come into the shelter to assisting our veterinarians with our surgery instruments and sanitizing them, to dog walking and providing that enrichment and care for our animals. They really are integrated into all aspects of what we do here. And so for me as the volunteer leader, my role is really to help with the recruiting, the onboarding, to support, of course, our volunteer base and to grow our program.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you have an incredible team. And one of the things I sort of gathered in this volunteer leaders group that I met you in was that there can be some really challenging and emotionally intense experience for both volunteers and staff in the work that you do. So I expect we'll probably dig into that a little bit more shortly. But one of the things I'm really interested in is how we set our volunteers up for success. And so I'm curious, what would you say your superpower is as a volunteer leader?
So that's a great question. I would say that my superpower is one that I think a lot of volunteer leaders actually have, and we just don't give ourselves credit for, which is adaptability. We wear so many hats minute to minute, hour to hour, and oftentimes I don't think we realize it or give ourselves credit for it. And that just sometimes at the end of the day, I'll sit down, I get home, I've taken a second and I go, wow, I was doing this, and then I was over here, and then I was here, and everything got done, and our volunteers got supported. And we are the ones that just quickly have to adapt. And I think that that's a superpower that a lot of us as volunteer leaders have, and we just don't give ourselves enough credit for it.
Yes, that's so well said. And I think also, like, sometimes when you're outside of working directly with volunteers, like that's a piece that gets lost a little bit too in like what really goes into a volunteer coordinator or manager kind of role. Um, Okay, so let's dig in a little bit further to mental health, boundaries, and self care as a volunteer leader. I know for myself, I've struggled in the past with feeling responsible for the positive experience of my volunteers, wanting to be an accessible um, and compassionate support and resource to them, and also feeling overwhelmed at times by taking on their emotions, around any frustrations or other challenging experiences they may be having in their role. So, why is this topic important to you? And can you give us an example of a time you felt like your mental health was impacted?
Oh gosh, absolutely. Start with talking about why it's so important to talk about. I think as volunteer leaders, we talk about mental health in regards to our volunteers and not necessarily about ourselves. And I think you were spot on in saying that we are fixers. We are the ones that want to make sure our volunteers are having a great experience, that they're getting out of it what they want as far as why they chose to come and volunteer with our organization. And I think that we forget to sit back for a second and go, okay, where are we at? Let's check in with ourselves. Organizations that have volunteers are typically ones with a mission, whether you're dealing with housing, you're dealing with animal welfare, such as myself, you're dealing with supportive care, you're dealing with accessibility to education and resources, you're dealing with socioeconomic challenges. And so volunteer leaders are in positions where you're dealing with a high stress environment across the board. And I think that we oftentimes forget to put our own oxygen masks on first before we help others. And we are the givers. We want to, what do you need? How can we fix it? And so we oftentimes forget to check in with ourselves. And one of the things that I really have started doing in the past, I would say year or so, is after a challenging conversation with a volunteer, or maybe a stressful situation with a citizen that we're trying to provide aid for, is sitting down and just asking myself, how am I feeling in that moment? And do I need to take a minute? We talk a lot about having open door policies here, and always being inviting. And I think as volunteer leaders, we want that. We want the volunteers to come to us. And I think it's important to make sure that we take that moment first before we are 100% with our volunteers. And I will tell you, one of the things that prompted this in the past year, as I mentioned, was in animal welfare, we deal with those that don't have a voice, right? We're dealing with animals that can't tell us what they've been through. I have yet to meet a dog that comes to our shelter and checks themselves in at the front counter. So we have backgrounds that we don't even know are happening, that we're working with. And so recently we had an instance where a volunteer was walking a dog, and the dog was outside and had fainted, what we thought was fainting. And it happened that we had a veterinary technician walk by at the same time. So they grabbed the dog, they rushed the dog inside to our medical clinic, and unfortunately the dog had passed away. And that volunteer took it incredibly personal and thought that the dog, could they have done something differently? Was it heat exhaustion being here in Florida? Was it something that they weren't paying attention to? Was there something on the kennel card that we should have looked at prior to taking the dog out? And I got with our veterinarian because I knew that this was going to be a very, very big thing for our team. And come to find out, the dog had a seizure and had passed away from neurological complications that was undiagnosed. We had no clue on, we had no prior history on, as I mentioned. And so I had to have that conversation with the volunteer as to there was nothing he could have done to prevent this. And to me, I explained it to him as, at least this dog had that opportunity to be out in the sun, in the grass, and that was his final moments. And it sparked a lot of conversations with other volunteers that came and talked to me, because they had known that dog and they started putting their own traumas and experiences with their animals onto this situation. And I am not a mental health professional. So having these volunteers come in and share with me, and I wanted them to have that experience. I wanted them to be able to sit down and have that emotional grief and to be able to grieve together through that, took a lot out of me. And I realized afterwards, this was probably a couple weeks it took me to really get under the understanding that I needed to take time for me. And so I actually took, those dreaded 3 letters that we don't like to admit, which is PTO. I took some time off and I made a long weekend out of it. And I really just disconnected, and I needed that in order to recharge and refuel my batteries to come back, because that is hard. And those situations are hard. And difficult conversations are exactly that. They're difficult, and we want to help, and we want to be there, and we want to be that support system. But we forget that we have to take that time to support ourselves.
Yeah, I just appreciate that so much. And it's interesting, like what you say about sort of the time frame of this, that it's become more clear to you in the last year. And like I really feel that for myself too. I don't work directly with volunteers anymore, but I feel like in the last year and a half, I've become so much more aware of like, what do I need for myself? And like you, I've been in many situations where I'm sort of a delayed processor, like it's not until later that I'm like, wow, I showed up for that, but it really took more out of me than I anticipated that it would. And so I really appreciate that, that wisdom of just like slowing down and like not underestimating what we do need for ourselves.
It's hard.
It is hard. Yeah. And we're so good at showing up for other people often, and not always so good at showing up for ourselves. I'm curious, like, how is that translating for you into boundaries? Like, are there particular boundaries that you set now with volunteers that help you take better care of yourself?
Oh, yes. So I want to back up for a second before I answer that, because it's triggered something else that I wanted to say, that we hear the word boundary and it's like a taboo word. in the volunteer leadership world. And I hope that can be changed. I hope that volunteer leaders, we look at boundaries as that oxygen mask that I mentioned earlier, in that a boundary is the way to make sure that for me, I am 100% on when I need to be on. Without boundaries, if you're 20% everywhere, you're 100% nowhere, right? And so I think it's important that we have those conversations around boundaries and what that looks like. I'll share 3 boundaries that I have that work really well for me, and for the past, as I mentioned, year or so, have really set me up for success, to be able to be healthy in this industry. The first one being is, when it comes to my off time, I am off. So volunteer emails, I do not answer them outside of emergencies when I'm off the clock. And even if you're salaried, you know, you may have office hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, Tuesday to Saturday, whatever that looks like. But the beauty of us working with volunteers is that their lifestyles and experiences and schedules are all over the place. So just because you have a traveling nurse that emails you at 3 a.m. because that's what works best for her, doesn't mean that she's expecting a response at 3:01 a.m. And we oftentimes pride ourselves in we're quick and, oh my gosh, you're so responsive, and that's awesome. And that's great. Do that when you're on the clock. Answering an email that's just about, hey, my hours were wrong, can you adjust that in the system at 7 o'clock at night, is not going to benefit anyone. And by doing that, you're going to teach not only your volunteers your boundaries, but it's not going to trigger you to then do something else and carry on with other work related things when you're off the clock. And for me, when I'm off, that's my family, that's my loved ones, that's my time. And so that has really helped me. The second boundary I'll share is social media. And this is a hot topic across the board. And social media, when it comes to our organizations, can be so powerful. GoFundMe's, sharing what your organization does, in regards to the programs you offer, or if you're trying to fundraise or recruiting volunteers, social media can be an amazing tool. When it comes to volunteer leadership, I have set the boundary that I will not friend request or allow any friend requests to come in for current volunteers of our organization. And I do that for a couple reasons. One, when we're at work, I don't want to see anything outside of work that may cloud my working relationship with that volunteer. What they post, how they comment, what their beliefs are outside of our organization. When we're here, we're serving the same mission. And so I want to make sure that that's the vision I see with them, and I'm not putting a filter on that based off of their social media presence. The second reason is that if I see a volunteer maybe post about they're doing this for the weekend, or they're going here, or they're whatnot, by seeing their name on my feed, it may trigger me to think about work. It may trigger me to think about, oh gosh, did I tell them this that other day? Or did I send that calendar invite? And now I'm back in work mode. So by not having the volunteers on my social media feed, it's sold to just when I'm on it, it's for my own personal use, and I'm able to have that disconnect. And that's worked really, really well for me. And then my third boundary, and probably the most important, is one that's actually at work. And that's when a volunteer wants to come and talk to me. If they want to vent, or they're upset, or they have a frustration, I ask 2 questions. Question 1, are you wanting me to be a listening ear or a helping hand? And so that kind of puts them, do they want me to just listen and let them vent whatever they've got going on? Or are they asking me because they want feedback at the end and they want help? And that kind of triggers their mind as to, okay, how am I going to frame this conversation? And then the second question I ask is this going to impact my mental well-being? And that sounds really weird to ask a volunteer. But again, it puts them into the mindset of, okay, am I going to share something that's also going to put weight on to Sarah? And it sounds weird, but I have volunteers now that they come into my office and they go, okay, I just need a listening ear. This is not going to impact your well-being, and I'm going to need about 10 minutes. So they already know the flow, and they're already ready for it. And oftentimes volunteer leaders, we don't want to put any ownership or any stress onto the volunteer. We don't want to have that vision of like, oh, I'm asking them of something, right? Because they're already giving by being part of our organization. But for me, especially being in animal welfare, we deal with some really difficult situations. And it's important that the volunteers understand, if they're going to share something, that also may impact me. And that we as volunteer leaders, I know we like to talk about our superpowers and how amazing we are, and we are, but we're also human. And so it's important that the volunteers take ownership of that as they have that conversation, because they need to understand that they're also impacting someone else with that, whatever they're going to share. And that's been really, really helpful. So those 3 boundaries have really set me up for success as far as my mental well-being here. And hopefully that's helpful for someone.
Oh, I love it so much. And that last piece that you shared, I think was the thing that like, it was just like light bulbs were going off. Like, oh my gosh, sometimes I feel like just having a little bit of language is like all I need to like totally revolutionize how I'm dealing with something. And I love that, that framing of the conversation, you know, like, what do you need from me? What, like, where are we going with this? And then also how, like, asking people to think about how their emotional situation might impact someone else. I just think that's, I mean, that could be broadened to so many other situations, but particularly with volunteers, it's like just such good perspective.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we have volunteers now that will come to me and say, "Do you have the space for this today? I want to talk to you about this."
Mm.
And that was never a question I would be asked before until we had these conversations around mental health. That was never something that would have been brought up. They just come in, and I still love it. They still come in and they're just like, "I got to talk to you about this." But now they know, or they'll be prompted, and just to be able to ask and say, "Do you have the space for this today, Sarah? I really need to talk to you about this." Or, "Hey, I just want to complain to you. Do you have 5 minutes to listen to me complain? I don't need any help. I just want to complain." And so they're taking ownership of what that conversation is going to look like, which has been a world of change.
Yeah, it just makes me think so much about a little bit of what I feel to be sort of unspoken in leadership in general often, but like this sort of owning of our expectations, you know, like what is my expectation of you on my team? What is your expectation of me? I feel like we have a lot of expectations that we don't tell other people about a lot. Um,
Yeah.
and that causes a lot of rub, you know, like even if it's just internal rub about how people show up with us. So I love that we've put some words to that. um, I guess I have a couple follow-up questions here. I'm just curious, like when you started implementing these practices, did it feel natural? Did it take some practice? Like how did that kind of get off the ground for you?
It evolved over time. I have the beauty of volunteers is that they all have different backgrounds and experiences. So I was able to leverage that and ask a few of them. I've got some retired nurses on our team. I've got some current teachers that are on my team. And so I really just asked them, like, how do I go about setting this? How do I go about saying, I need you to tell me what kind of conversation you want to have? And so that's where we came up with the, do you need a helping hand or a listening ear? But it was not at all comfortable at first. Again, I am someone that wants to fix and help, and I am that absolutely 2 a.m. in the morning, call me, I'll be there. How fast do you need me to be there? Jump and how high? And that's just, I think a lot of volunteer leaders, we are just naturally that way. And so it was very uncomfortable at first. It was very unnatural. And I think if it wasn't for our volunteers also opening up and saying, "Yes, I've just had a really rough day," or "Yes, I talked to my therapist about this last week," or, "I just came from having this situation with my kids." And without them being human with me, in order for me to be human with them, I don't think we would get where we are now. And I think that if I were to give anyone advice in regards to that situation, in regards to having those conversations and being open with their volunteers, I would say exactly that. Be open. It's okay to lay down your superhero cape for 2 seconds if it means that you're going to be able to help so many more
Mm.
down the road.
Yeah, I really like that. I feel like um in my like working with volunteers, it definitely evolved over the years, and the longer I was there and the more comfortable I felt with people, the more I felt like I could integrate a little bit more of like my authentic self in, you know, as opposed to just showing up as this like rigid professional all the time. And that's a really beautiful gift to give people, is to show them a little bit of your you know, your vulnerability too. And I think that in turn allows them to show up that way. Yeah. And it sounds like there have been some really positive outcomes for the whole team with these shifts. So that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, and I will say that a lot of times, when I do have those conversations around like, hey, I'll have a newer volunteer, for example, that's tried to friend request me on a social media platform, and I'll have the follow-up conversation of like, hey, this is not anything against you. This is just a boundary I've sat with myself. Um, they get it, and there's no like, they don't take offense. Oftentimes, if there's something that they want to share, they'll still email it to me. I get, hey, here's the recipe that when we did the potluck, here's the recipe I wanted to give you. Or, oh my gosh, my grandkid, it's their first day at college. I wanted to send you the dorm photos. So I still get those connections, and I still get that personal touch. And it just doesn't have to be through the social media platform. So to your point, being vulnerable and saying, hey, this is where I'm coming from is not a bad thing. It reminds the volunteers that you're not just the volunteer coordinator for this organization, that you're, for me, I'm Sarah. And I have a whole life outside of just being here and my passions. And so I think it's important to just be open and be okay with being open.
Yes, I love that. So, I'm curious too, on the flip side of sort of care for yourself, are there strategies that you're using to help volunteers manage their own mental health related to their roles?
Yes. And I think that any volunteer leader who's focused on their own well-being, it kind of carries into their volunteers and vice versa. I think a big piece, first and foremost, here at our organization is that any training or any staff meetings we do, we invite our volunteers to attend as well. So for animal welfare, and I think that this is in a lot of nonprofit organizations, is compassion fatigue. And so having that, identifying compassion fatigue, what does that mean? Burnout, those types of things. So we invite our volunteers to attend all of those. We also do a support group once a month for our rescue groups, our nonprofit partners that we work with, as well as our volunteers that can attend a support group. It's done after hours, and they can attend for an hour a month. And then I like to do what's called check-ins. So if I know that a certain difficult situation is coming up, or we've just gone through something very stressful, I try to keep a pulse on our volunteers. And for some organizations that are really large, that may be something that you defer to the supervisors in those areas to do so. But it's very important just to check in. How are you? What's going on? How are you doing after that? How did you feel after that? I went through a training about 6 months ago called Mental Health First Aid. And it was really, really eye-opening in regards to just how to have those conversations. We're so open about asking, like, how's your broken foot healing? And how is, your arm cast doing? So that physical health, we have no problem asking questions on, but the mental health piece can be a challenge. And so I like to make sure that I put myself in those conversations, and I force myself to go and check in with volunteers because it's important. They have lives outside of the organization too. And oftentimes it's something that if they're upset or they're frustrated, they bring that into their volunteer shift. And they sometimes just want that listening ear. So it's important to make sure that that's offered to them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm just curious with the like a volunteer support group, how do you get that going? And like how does it sustain itself?
Yeah, so my supervisor Gina actually runs that. She does it with our nonprofits and our rescue partners. And when she initially launched it, she actually had a mental health professional come in and hosted the first several sessions to kind of get how to do the meeting, how to make sure it doesn't just turn into we're all opening up and there's not getting anything out of it. And so how did that construction look? And then now it kind of runs itself organically. The same people show up and they'll do different activities. The other day they were painting rocks, which was really cool. And so they've done different things where there's always a yes, you can share, but then what are we doing to impact that mental health going forward? So I would say for anyone that's looking to do that, don't reinvent the wheel. See what's out there, see what is available. If you have an EAP, for example, an employee assistance program, see if there's any professionals through that are willing to jump on and even do a Zoom to a group and go that route. Setting some boundaries and some rules first with those groups is very important. So like what happens during that support group stays in that support group, making sure that we're there to help and not to judge. And once you've got it set up and you've got those parameters, you'll be amazed to see what can happen with it, and who comes up with ideas and what they want to do. And all of a sudden you'll see snacks show up and people are invested, because they want that time. It's hard to explain to family or friends that aren't part of your organization what it is that they're up against and what they're doing. So to talk to someone else who is a part of that can go a long way for their mental health.
I really like that. Um, awesome. Such good strategies. So this could be very general, or it could be in relation to the topic that we've been talking about, but do you have other advice that you'd give to volunteer leaders?
Oh gosh, yes. um, so I've been in the volunteer world here specifically for almost 6 years. And if there's one thing that I wish I could shout from the rooftops to every volunteer leader out there, is take time for you. We do not pat ourselves on the back enough. We do not take time to invest in our own growth and development enough. So if that's taking vacations, if that's focusing on your own career path, so getting your certification, your CVA, if that's going to school, if that's doing additional organizational structure things such as service enterprise, whatever you can do to take that white space on your calendar and have it to where it's focused on you for a bit, that's all that's going to do is help the organization, but it's also going to help you and set you up for not having burnout and staying in your industry for longer than you may not have already if you don't spend that time. So I have white space on my calendar 3 days a week for an hour where it's just me time, where I focus on, okay, I wanted to take this webinar that was recorded, or I wanted to jump on this really cool call, or when I invested in getting my CVA a couple years ago, taking that time for me has helped me be a better volunteer leader, has helped me be more focused when I need to be here and on and 100% for the team. And if you don't take that time, again, if you're 20% everywhere, you're 100% nowhere. So it's okay to take time for you. If that's personal growth, if that's professional growth, if that's just your PTO and your time off, make sure you're taking it because it's only going to help you. And I wish someone had told me that when I first started, because I wanted to be everything for everyone all the time. And as I've been in this industry and grown in this industry longer, I've realized that taking the time for me helps me set the team up for better success.
I love that. There's so much wisdom in that. And I'm guessing you defend those 3 hours on your calendar like crazy.
I do. And I take it as a compliment. I have volunteers that'll still knock on my door if the door's closed, because my door's always open. And I joke and say, if the door's closed, I'm eating a pub sub. And so, just take that with a grain of salt if you open it up and I've got, chicken tenders coming out of my mouth. But it's important to take that time, because it could be something that does benefit my volunteers or does benefit the organization. And the amount of resources that are out there for volunteer leaders, your organization, for example, I can think of associations through Alive and Engage and Better Impact. There's so many out there that are there to support us in what we do. And oftentimes, I think as volunteer leaders, we put ourselves in these little silos and we think that we're the only ones. And I hope that folks spend more time getting out there and learning what's out there and accessible to them, so that they're not having to reinvent the wheel. And that will help with workload, that'll help with their work satisfaction, that'll help with their overall mentality of being while they're at work, when they reach out and ask for help and spend that time to develop themselves.
Yeah, it's so important. And I feel like, every single one of us who's been in any kind of leadership role, there's always going to be 50 million things still on your to-do list that you could have done in those 3 hours. And it's so easy to sort of get bogged down in the weeds. But I always felt like when I had a little bit more time to pick my head up, look around, see what the big picture was, like I always felt so much more energized and connected and inspired. And so yeah, and no one's going to take that time for you. Like you really do have to make it happen for yourself.
Absolutely. And oftentimes organizations don't know if you are the only volunteer leader or you're the one that's overseeing a volunteer program. your director or board of directors or executive manager may not know that there's these organizations out there that can support you. So they're not going to tell you. You have to find it and go out there and advocate for yourself and show that these are some things I want to join. These are some things I want to do. This is the time I want to spend to learn this. And it's not through that they don't want to support. It's oftentimes that they don't know and they're not aware. And so as volunteer leaders, like you said, we have to advocate for ourselves.
Yes. So I think we're approaching wind down, unless there are things that we haven't discussed that you want to make sure we include in this conversation. I just have a couple sort of fun little questions to wrap up.
Sure.
Is there anything you want to add that we haven't talked about?
No, I feel like this has been such a great conversation.
Me too. Okay, so my first question is, what brings you joy or makes you feel grateful to work with volunteers?
The possibilities, the possibilities. Volunteers, I know I've said this already, but they all have such different backgrounds and experiences, and their why. As much as we love being in our roles, we're still collecting a paycheck. Oftentimes we're getting benefits. So the why for a volunteer will always be different than an employee. And what they bring to the table, I mean, I have a adjunct professor. She's a trauma nurse that oversees our low-cost shot clinic and scribes for our veterinarian. I have a retired pharmacist who has reorganized our entire process for our medical onboarding. I have teachers who do our kitten fostering because that gives them something to do during the summer. And all of these things have been built and grown and supporting so that we can help our community because of the volunteers. And so I find such happiness and joy in tapping into what our volunteers are capable of. And to know that that's happening with organizations across the world in all different sectors is just, it's mind blowing. It's just amazing. And so the possibilities.
Beautifully said. And the lightning round last question, what's your favorite way to recognize or show appreciation for your volunteers?
Okay, so I have two answers to this.
Great.
My first answer is going to be the everyday thank yous. I am a huge fan of randomness. And so I love to do Post-it note thank yous. We have a volunteer room. And when they clock in and clock out, I love to leave little folded up Post-it notes that just say their name. And so when they come in to clock in, they'll take their little Post-it, unfold it, and on the back, it'll have something that they probably don't know that I know to say thank you to them. And I love that because it's unexpected. It's probably something that I don't even know exactly what I'm explaining to them, such as a medical term. And a veterinarian or a vet tech will say, oh my gosh, they were amazing at cleaning the autoclave. And I'm like, I don't even know what an autoclave is. But I'll leave a little Post-it note that says that. And those go such a long way to start a shift or to end a shift with my Post-it note thank yous. And then my second is sending things to volunteers' homes. So even if it's a birthday card or just a thank you letter in the mail, very, very rarely now do we get mail, physical mail, that's not junk mail or a bill, right? Yep. And so for them to get something in their mailbox that's from me as a signed little card, maybe my leadership team has signed it, or maybe it's a birthday card. To get things in the mail, again, it's that unexpected piece. And I personally am old school and I love getting mail, postcards, all that kind of stuff. So that's probably my second favorite way.
I love those. I'm telling you, the personal touches are like totally where it's at. It makes such a big difference.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, I love geeking out on volunteer engagement ideas. So I'm really happy to have had the chance to geek out with you a little bit. And this conversation has been super fun and helpful and practical. There's so much goodness in here. I'm excited to share with everybody. So thank you for sharing your time and your experience. And I hope our paths cross again before too long.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been such a pleasure. I have really enjoyed talking with you. And I agree. It's fun when you get to geek out over volunteer stuff with another volunteer leader. So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to tuning into future podcasts.